Okay. Hello, everybody. Doing okay? Doing well. I apologize for the mix up. First of all, last week that I overslept, and today that we didn't realize that the clocks had changed. So I'm sorry if you were on earlier and we missed you. Um, okay. So, so there's so much here. It's like such a big and complex situation. And I jotted down like a bunch of notes for myself here to try to um, sift through things and present a coherent, you know, outline or framework to try to understand what's going on in the world. Okay, so let's just take things really piece by piece. I'm going to share my screen with you. We're going to look at a map for a minute. And to help start try to understand what's happening and why. Okay, so here's a map of Europe. We're down here in Israel, and up here is Ukraine. It's a very, very big country, right? Here's Ukraine. Up to the north and east, this is all Russia, this big area. To the immediate north is Belarus, and to the west is Poland. Okay. And right now, Russia has invaded Ukraine mostly in this area, like the eastern areas of Ukraine. However, there's been fighting all the way up to this city of Lviv, and there was a bombing 2 days ago, like right near the border with Poland. Didn't cross the border because that would trigger World War III, but it was right near the border with Poland. So first, let's just understand very, very basic what's happened over here in the world since World War II. Okay, we know that World War II, the Germans were defeated. We know that the allies, like the good guys, right, America and the United Kingdom from the West. So we fought coming in, starting from France and Normandy. We fought all the way across and we got to Berlin, right? And this whole area, the whole western part of Europe, was liberated by Americans and the Western countries. And from the East, it was the Russians, right? The Germans in 1941, when the war broke out in 39, Poland was divided in half, and the left half, the western half, was Germany, the eastern half was Russia. In 1941, that's what was called Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler double-crossed Stalin and he invaded Russia. And that's really when the Holocaust began. That's when, the until that time, the Jews were in ghettos, but there were no gas chambers and they were not, mass shootings into pits. That began in 1941 with the operation going into Russia, because at that point, millions and millions of more Jews came under the Nazi rule. So at the end of the war, though, the Nazis lost trying to fight against Russia, and Russia fought back all the way from the east, pushing westward. So all of these countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, all of Poland, right, Slovakia, up until East Berlin, that was all liberated by the Russians, by the Soviet army. And they met in Berlin, right? There was the Berlin Wall that divided West and East Berlin. And to the west was the Western countries and democracy. And to the east was the Soviet Union. Now, as opposed to the Western countries, we stayed in Germany and those places for some time, a few years, but then we left and let them build themselves back up and become their own country. The Russians did not do that. The countries that the Russians liberated, so to speak, from the Germans, like Poland and Belarus and Ukraine, they stayed and they incorporated those countries into the USSR, the Soviet Union. Which was this giant conglomeration of countries, this whole gigantic, massive area. And it was all one block. And even though technically Poland was its own country and Belarus and Ukraine, they had their own countries, but they were all just basically subservient to Moscow and subservient to Stalin. And we'll talk about that because terrible, terrible things happened during those times, specifically in Ukraine. Now, at that point in time, right, when World War II ended, so now began the Cold War. Right? What was the Cold War? The Cold War was, as opposed to a hot war, which is what's happening now in Ukraine with weaponry and violence, a Cold War was, everything in a war minus the violence, meaning two countries trying to become more powerful, two countries trying to undermine each other. I'm talking about here Russia and America primarily. And this went on for many, many decades. And in order to protect against Russia and the spread of communism, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established. That's NATO. So NATO was set up by the Western countries. America is by far the most important and powerful NATO member. This was one of the big things about Donald Trump's presidency, is he was very against how much NATO was supported by America and how little the other countries were doing to pull their weight and all of that. That was something that Donald Trump made a very big deal about, and which maybe had an effect on what's happening now, which we'll talk about, right? But the NATO was established in order to create a joint defense against the Soviet Union. And the NATO pact was that any country that is a part of it, which is all those Western countries, that basically if any one of them was attacked by the Soviet Union, it was as if they were all attacked. It was an alliance to go to war in defense of each other, and that the Soviet Union knows that, and knows that if they attack France, then they're going to have to fight Britain and America also. So any country that's in NATO is a country that is defended by the other countries, and it was specifically set up in order to defend against the Soviet Union. Okay, now this went on for many decades, and like my whole childhood through the 70s and 80s was the height of the Cold War, and and NATO versus and Russia did its own thing called the Warsaw Pact, and Russia made its own version of NATO to the east of also all the different countries that were under the Soviet Union. Also, if any of them would be attacked, it would be all for one and one for all. Okay, what happened through the 1980s was that the Soviet Union collapsed. Financially, it was no longer able to sustain itself. Communism was not working. Capitalism was really working and beating out communism as a system. And the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 80s. What does it mean it collapsed? It means that the countries had the opportunity to break free if they wanted to. Like each country held a referendum, like a vote, and they decided if they wanted to remain a part of the Soviet Union or not. So country after country voted to free themselves from the Soviet Union with overwhelming majorities. Ukraine was like 98% or something like that. Poland, huge percentage. So that was like in the late 80s, going into the early 90s. What happened is that all of these countries, right, that were around Russia, right? Russia, again, is the big, big, big one. But all these other countries became independent countries. Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, they all became independent and took on their own version of government, some more democratic, some less democratic, right? But they all became completely separated and independent from the Soviet Union. And that was like the end of the Cold War, and we won. America won. Now, with that win, we had sort of a choice, right? The world and the West had a choice. Like, do we gloat and stick it to them and show them how badly they lost, or do we let them sort of lose gracefully and not rub it in their face? And what was one of the ways of determining that was how the West was now going to treat the former Soviet Union countries, meaning Russia now, what's the word? Reluctantly, Russia gave up control of Poland and Lithuania and Belarus and Ukraine, right? It gave up control of these countries. Now, America gave sort of a guarantee to Russia that we're not going to we're not going to push for these countries to join NATO, right? In other words, like NATO now is much more powerful than Russia, right? Because Russia is no longer the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact is now dissolved. So Russia is just a country. It's a big country, a strong country, but it's just one country. And NATO is now this conglomeration of many powerful countries. And Russia was very concerned that the countries near Russia should not become NATO countries, because then that's like, people who are militarily aligned against Russia, mamash, right up onto Russia's borders. And, it would have made sense to do that. It would have made sense to leave those countries be and not try to encourage them to come into NATO and just, let things be. But that's not what happened. What happened is that one after another, those countries wanted to be a part of NATO. Poland hates Russia, has always hated Russia. And as soon as they were out of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, immediately they wanted to join NATO and started lobbying NATO to join. Other countries, the Czech Republic, Hungary, a lot of these other countries started to lobby and join, to get NATO membership, and NATO accepted. So Poland has been a member of NATO now for over 20 years. The other countries in that area, also Hungary, Slovakia, these are all, I think Slovakia, I'm not sure, these are all NATO countries. And over the past 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, slowly NATO has been creeping closer and closer and closer to Russia. Okay. Now, Russia has been very vocal about this, that they are not happy about this. They Putin has been talking about this for 25 years, that he, felt betrayed by these countries joining NATO, because there was sort of this deal that was made when the Soviet Union collapsed that NATO was not going to encroach on these Eastern European countries. However, those countries have a say themselves, right? The people of Poland don't care really if Putin wants them to join NATO or not. Basically what happened is that, NATO has crept right up to Russia's doorstep. And that means that, if Poland, let's say again, is a NATO country, it's the closest NATO country to Russia. So on Poland's eastern border, Poland could put missile systems and defense systems and, all of those things that have the ability to hit and affect Russia proper. So when the discussion about Ukraine came up, whether Ukraine would be a country that could join NATO or not, it was something that made Russia very, very, very nervous. So now let's zoom in on Ukraine specifically itself. Okay, Ukraine was, like we said, was occupied by the Soviet Union, by the Russians at the end of World War II. Ukraine has a lot of very valuable resources. There's a lot of oil there. There's a lot of wheat over there. Something like a third, maybe, of the world's wheat or something like that. I don't know. There's like a huge amount of very, very, very valuable natural resources that exist in Ukraine. And it was something that for Russia was extremely important, strategically and economically. And it was a major part of Stalin's plan of modernizing Russia in the 1930s and 40s was Ukraine, and what was going to be with Ukraine and the farmers in Ukraine. So as a part of what Russia did with Ukraine, they did a few things. Number one is they moved many, many, many ethnic Russians into Ukraine. Ethnic Russians, meaning people who are from Russia proper, who speak Russian, not Ukrainian. And in order to create like a cultural presence in Ukraine, Russia moved in hundreds of thousands of people into Ukraine. And at the same time, many, many, many Ukrainians, somewhere between 7 and 10 million Ukrainians died in the 1940s through famine. And this is a terrible, terrible story. It's basically its own Holocaust. They call it the Holodomor, which is the word means like the famine. And basically, in order to pretend that communism was working and that there was enough food for the Soviet Union, under Stalin, the Russians forcibly took all of the grain from Ukraine for 2 or 3 years, 1942, 43. They took all the grain from there and in order to distribute it to the rest of Russia. And the Ukrainian farmers and people who were growing the grain were not allowed to eat it. And of course, the Russians, mean anybody who stole even a tiny bit, they were killed. And this created an enormous, enormous famine in which somewhere between 7 and 10 million Ukrainians starved to death. This is like a horrific, historical tragedy that not so many people know about. But it was like mamish, a Ukrainian Holocaust perpetrated by Stalin, and that's obviously something that the Ukrainians remember and have, very strongly in their memory. Okay, so that's part of the history of Ukraine is this very deep divide between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and at the same time, there are many, many Russians living in Ukraine because the Russian people moved them in there. Now, over the past 20 years, Ukraine has been on the border, both physically and also like sort of metaphorically, between the East and the West. Whereas Poland, that I mentioned, is a member of Nato and a member of the EU, and like Poland is like a regular Western country, Ukraine was not a part of Nato and not a part of the EU. In 2014, so there, not so long ago, there was a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. A government that was, more interested in joining Russia than the EU. And there was an uprising in the country in 2014. There was a huge uprising and like a popular uprising, and they ousted the president and they brought in another president that was much closer to the EU and much warmer to Europe in general and colder to Russia. And that's basically where the government has been since, meaning the government of Ukraine has been a government that has been not looking to make stronger ties with Putin. It's been a government that's been trying to get into the EU and wanting to join NATO. Now, what would have been wise for the West to do would have been to just categorically say, sorry, Ukraine, we're not letting you in NATO, right? We're not going to do that. We're not letting you in the EU. We're not letting you in NATO. The reason being is that would be too much of a provocation to Putin. It would be too much of a, shoving his face in it to put Ukraine, which is, literally a major country with massive resources that Russia feels very connected to take Ukraine and make that a part of the EU and make that a part of NATO. That would be like way too much of a provocation. And, they should have just said years ago to Ukraine, sorry, no dice, we're not doing it. We're not going to let you in NATO. Sorry. However, that's not what we did. The West for years has been making it sound like we would allow Ukraine into NATO and making it sound like we would, potentially even come to Ukraine's defense if they were attacked. The question of how open to Ukraine Europe would be was something that was very open. And this guy, the current president, his name is Vladimir Zelensky, very, very strongly wanted to join the EU and tried to position Ukraine as a country that was like, ready to be a part of the West. Now, all of this basically was too much for Putin and, the Russian government to take. And it was too much of a threat, and putting a NATO country, mamash, deep into Russian territory, like you see how far Ukraine goes in. So that basically Putin said it can't happen. And he therefore came up with a number of pretexts, a number of reasons of why it was necessary for Russia to go in and invade Ukraine. And that's what happened now 3 weeks ago or so. Russia, based on a number of reasons, which are very important to understand, which we're going to talk about in a minute, went in and invaded the country of Ukraine. And that's where we are now, that there's a war going on. People say it could have been avoided if we would have just said very clearly to Russia, we're not going to accept Ukraine into the EU. It's just not going to happen. And if we would have done that, or NATO, then, it could be that Putin would have been satisfied. But that didn't happen. So instead he invaded, and now thousands of people are dying. Okay, that is like a very brief overview of how we got to where we are. obviously, there's no question that Putin is the bad guy here, right? Putin is a Russia and a murderer and a thug and all of these things. He's very, very bad. And even if we're trying to like point at flaws in what American foreign policy was and like things that maybe could have been done to not make it so bad, that's in no way an excuse, or in any which way am I condoning anything that Putin did. I'm just explaining that there was a historical lead up to this that really could have been avoided, maybe, and now there's mamish war. Now a war in Europe like this is extremely significant. There's been small wars in Europe over the past 20 years. There was a war in Chechnya, there was a war in Kosovo. However, since World War II, there has not been a war of this scale and with these, this level of countries involved, like in Europe proper. And that's why, we're supposed to have a Poland trip in a week and a half, 2 weeks, and the parents are freaking out because it's very, it all looks the same, Poland and Ukraine, they're close to each other. And but there's a huge difference, right? In other words, Ukraine is not a part of NATO, not a part of the EU, and that's why they're being pounded and nobody's doing anything about it. If a single bomb would, chas v'shalom, chalila v'chalila, if a single bomb would cross the Polish border and land on Polish soil, so then that would officially be World War III. Official, right? That's NATO. Once one NATO country is attacked, then all of NATO is at war. So there's like a huge difference between Poland and Ukraine in this sense. Ukraine, unfortunately for them, fortunately for the rest of us, but unfortunately for Ukraine, they are on their own. There's no treaty, there's no alliance that's there to save them and protect them, which is why nobody's coming to protect them. Whereas Poland is a member of NATO, and if Poland would be attacked, that would trigger World War III on the spot. So I'm trying to explain to the parents there's like a very big difference between Ukraine and Poland, and the safety in terms of traveling to Ukraine and traveling to Poland. Okay, now why did Putin say he's going into Ukraine? He didn't just say I don't want to let them join the EU, so I'm gonna attack. That would sound very not not okay to do. So he is going in with the following goals in mind. Okay, number one, the denazification of Ukraine. The Nazi party has become very strong in Ukraine. There's a number of Nazi parties that are still active in Ukraine. And even though the president of Ukraine is Jewish, right, Vladimir Zelensky is the president, is actually Jewish, but that doesn't mean that there's not a very strong Nazi presence. And that's number one, is that Putin said he wants to go in and enforce a regime change, right, a government change to a government that will not be so sympathetic to the Nazis. Okay, that's number one. Number two, he said that in Ukraine, there are chemical and biological weapon laboratories that are not safely secured by the Ukrainians, and that are potential security threats to Russia, because if terrorist groups would get a hold of those locations, or if somebody in Ukraine would sell those weapons to a terrorist group or something, that would be a huge threat to Russian security. And they're going in to secure these biological and chemical weapon laboratories. That's number two of what he said. And number three, in general, is to demilitarize Ukraine, meaning, right, Russia's problem is that NATO is a military alliance, and to have a military alliance with all of that weaponry right on Russia's door is very threatening. So his goal number three is that Ukraine should not have a heavy offensive military capability. Right? Those are his three goals, and why he said he's going in. Now, obviously, it's terrible, and people are dying, and anytime a war happens and occupation, and doesn't matter what the reasons are and if they're legitimate or not, the people on the street, just regular, men, women, and children, unfortunately, are the ones who suffer. And that's definitely what's happening right now, that just the regular people are suffering terribly. And, like we said last time, regardless of whether or not they're historically anti-Semites and all of that stuff, which may very well be. And at the same time, we should have sympathy for human beings who are suffering and going through difficulty. And there are many, many, many Jews that are there and that are stuck. There's a friend of our family, a family friend, a couple who's getting married in a few weeks, and the guy happens to be Ukrainian. He's been living here now for a number of years, but his brother and family are in Ukraine, in a city that is occupied by Russia. And he said it's just crazy. His brother is, just like there's Russian troops walking on the streets. It's a very, very terrifying, terrifying situation, and it's awful for the people, at the that are affected by it. And at the same time, it's really important to try to understand some of these bigger ideas and bigger pictures about what's going on and whether that's legitimate or not legitimate, and all of that. So I want to just take a step back and okay, I was alive for 9/11, and I remember it obviously very, very clearly, and I remember the feeling in America afterwards. And how it was a completely life altering and perspective altering time, and there was no question, right, within a few months after September 11th, that when America went in and invaded Afghanistan, and they went in because the Taliban, who had engineered 9/11, they were located in Afghanistan, and apparently they were being given protection by the Taliban and the Afghanistan government. So Al-Qaeda was being protected. So when America went into Afghanistan, everybody was on board. I was like, they deserved it, they needed to go in there, and okay. But then about a year later, there was another invasion, and that was Iraq. Right, America went in and invaded Iraq, and took out, in the end, took and killed Saddam Hussein. And I remember this very clearly. I was an adult already when this happened. And it was, absolutely clear to the world, the media and the government and everything, that why did we go into Iraq? There were two reasons. Okay. Number one is that Saddam Hussein had very close ties and very close support to Al-Qaeda. And there are books published about it, and papers and all sorts of things showing very strong ties between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, even though it really doesn't make any sense. Saddam Hussein was a totally secular Ba'athist, and Osama bin Laden was like, radical Islamic fundamentalist, but it didn't matter. There was, incontrovertible evidence that Osama bin Laden had been supported and, helped by Saddam Hussein. And number two, Saddam Hussein had been developing weapons of mass destruction, WMD, weapons of mass destruction. These words were drilled into our heads, through all the media, through any government talk. There was a very famous speech that Colin Powell, who was the general in America, he gave a speech at the UN giving all the proof that we had that Saddam Hussein was developing chemical, biological, nuclear weapons of mass destruction. And we had to go in there to Iraq in order to make sure that we stopped him from developing these weapons and selling them to terrorists and anything like that. And America, with the full power of the American army, we went into Iraq and we toppled that government. We found and killed Saddam. We found and killed his kids. We, completely gutted that country and, took over. And not a single weapon of mass destruction was found. Not a single laboratory, making biological or chemical weapons was found. All of the links between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein were totally false and totally made up. And one of the greatest history altering events of the 20th century, which, the invasion of Iraq, and then, everything that happened after that, ISIS, and the whole destabilization of the Middle East, and stuff that's still going on today, is all as a result of this invasion that America did. And again, I lived through this, and as an adult, and I remember, rooting America on and feeling like, of course, we have to do this. And at the time, the French didn't want to join. There was like a coalition. George Bush was putting together a coalition of countries who were going to be involved and help in in attacking Iraq, and France wouldn't be involved. And I remember everybody like hated France for a few years. Then they stopped calling them French fries; they were called freedom fries. And everyone, not French toast, it was frontier toast. Everyone was like anti-France because France refused to join this thing. And I'm telling you, I lived through this, and I remember it very clearly, and I remember feeling this way and supporting all of this. And now, historically, though, in retrospect, this was an absolute check error. It was an absolute lie. It was all about money. That's all it was about. There was absolutely no strategic and world political reason to do this. The entire reason for the war in Iraq is clear as day, and there's no argument anymore. It was just about money. It was about the oil that was there. And it was about the military industrial complex that makes trillions of dollars off of wars. And the Iraq invasion is a major blight on America's moral authority in this area, right? In other words, from Putin's point of view, and again, I'm not supporting him and I'm not defending him, and he's a Russia and he's a bad guy and all of those things, right? But from his point of view, it's very, very hard to criticize what he's doing, right? When America has basically done the same thing, like went into Iraq to change the government over and to secure weapons of mass destruction that never existed. And not only that, but this past week, something crazy happened in Congress or in the Senate. So Marco Rubio, I don't know, he's a senator, right? Or a congressman or a senator, I think a senator from Florida. Marco Rubio was questioning a woman from the Defense Department who was testifying about what's going on in Ukraine. Now, until now, anybody who said anything about weapon labs in Ukraine was called a Putinist. You were just pushing Russian propaganda, right? If you spoke about weapon labs in Ukraine, and as if they were actually real, so then you were defending Putin's defense of invading Ukraine, right? A week ago, if you would have tweeted something about bio labs in Ukraine, you would have been branded a Russian, a Russian plant, Russian disinformation spreader. Okay, but now Marco Rubio is questioning this woman, and he says to her, obviously expecting to get a very different answer. He said to her, "Can you please state for the record, as far as you know, are there chemical or biological weapon laboratories in Ukraine?" And rather than the woman just saying no, which is clearly what he expected, you could watch this video. I recommend you watch it because you could see for yourself how ridiculous this is. She says, "Well, there are biological research facilities, and we're concerned that some of those materials might fall into the hands of the Russians." In other words, yes, there are bio and chemical, labs over there. And like you could see in the video, he's visibly shocked by this answer because it's like not what he wanted to hear. And then he says, "Okay, but I just want to make clear, if there's a biological or chemical attack in Ukraine, we're 100% certain that it would be from the Russians and not the Ukrainians, right?" And she's like, "Yes, right. Of course it would be from the Russians and not the Ukrainians, right?" But in that one moment, mamash, in that one moment, you have an American woman who did something very strange and told the truth, right? But she basically said, "Yeah, it is true. There are these labs over there," and right in that one moment, Putin's justification for invading Ukraine just got more evidence than America's invasion of Iraq ever had. You know what I mean? For their justification. So again, I'm not trying to compare America to Russia, and but I am a little bit, you know what I mean? But the Lamaisa, the CIA and the deep state in America has done a lot of really, really awful things. And we don't have the moral standing that maybe we once did. I don't know if we ever did, but we don't have really the moral standing to be able to say like, no, this is wrong, and we can't do things like this. Of course we're saying it, and of course but it's really hypocritical, and a lot of people, certainly Putin, sees that and recognizes it, and and that's a very, very important backdrop to have about this. That okay, so that's okay. That's point number 2. We got a little bit of the history and how we got here. The NATO expansion. We have the why Putin says he's doing it, and that it's kind of actually complicated in that respect. I want to talk about now how this is affecting Israel, because it's actually having quite difficult. It's putting Israel in a very, very difficult situation. This whole matzav. Okay, now what the world's response to Russia has been is not been militarily, because that would, again, nobody wants World War III. So people talk about, well, we should set up a no-fly zone, right? A no-fly zone is like we've done many other places in the world. That's where NATO would say, look, you're not allowed to fly any airplanes over the skies in Ukraine. And Russia, no flights, you can't fly, and that would help to equal out the forces, right? Because Ukraine does not have an air force or a strong air force, and they don't. If all the fighting would just be on the ground, then they would have a fair chance. So imposing a no-fly zone, which takes out the air superiority of the Russians, would be a very big help to the Ukrainians. So a lot of people are saying we should be doing more, and we should be instituting a no-fly zone. But that's really very crazy. That's like a crazy thing to do, because a no-fly zone would mean shooting Russian planes down. And if we shoot a Russian plane down, we've started World War III. So like, we can't do that. And Putin knows this. He knows all of this. He knows that, nobody's really going to do anything militarily, because if they do anything, then he's going to, and that's going to lead escalations. And within 2 days, it's going to be a conflict that nobody wants. So basically, as a result, Ukraine is being sort of not sacrificed, but nobody's coming to help them. Nobody's coming and helping them. Nobody's fighting for them. Even giving them weapons is very complicated. There was this whole thing that happened. I don't know if you saw this, but that Poland had 10 airplanes, the fighter jets, that they were willing to let Ukraine have, but they didn't want to give it to Ukraine directly, because again, that would be like a real provocation of Putin, right? So instead, they wanted to give the planes to America to give to Ukraine, but America wouldn't do it, because it would be a big provocation to Putin. So, everybody is very, very nervous about doing anything that is going to escalate the war, and I think that's a good thing, meaning that escalation is bad. We've never been so close to World War III in a very, very long time. And of course, we all know that Putin has nuclear weapons, and that that means that any escalation has the possibility of getting way, way, way out of hand. So the fear of nothing by accident happening that could let things get much worse is again like an attack that accidentally crosses the border and hits Poland. So that's bad news, because that'll trigger World War III. Right now, there's 3 leaders from Poland and Hungary and somewhere else that are in Ukraine, in a visit to show solidarity. But if like something would happen to them while they were there, that would also trigger World War III. There's like a lot of things that could happen, Khalila, that, and unfortunately, sometimes in wars, that's what happens. Things spiral out of hand, not necessarily what was planned. And, so there's no question that it's a very tenuous, tense situation in the world. We should certainly be davening, and, that things should calm down, and davening that there should be, calm. However, we should not be expecting to see anybody really stepping up to Putin militarily, because any sort of escalation here would send things over the edge, and nobody wants to see that happen. Okay, now why? So what is the world doing, right? So we're doing financial warfare, right? Financial sanctions, and this is massive. Okay, but what's happening now in Russia financially it's like a financial nuclear bomb is basically what was dropped for the first time since like the 60s now. over the past 50 years, American companies have been moving into Russia and doing business in Russia. And like I remember, when McDonald's opened in Russia in the 80s for the first time, and all these things. And that's good. It's good when there's Western countries in a country like Russia. It's good when they're able to see like, oh, Coca-Cola is good and Starbucks and these types of things. It creates sort of like a bridge, a cultural bridge between the two countries. However, the world now has imposed very, very strong sanctions on Russia. What sanctions means are economic punishments. And basically, companies are not allowed to do business with Russia anymore. So it's like crazy. But for the first time in 50 years now, there's almost no American companies left in Russia. Like all the major companies shut down. Coca-Cola, Apple, Google, all the major companies, McDonald's, Nike, Starbucks, just everything is shutting down. That's thousands and thousands of people losing their jobs, right? All the people that work for these companies, and no American airlines, no foreign airlines are flying into Russia anymore. So like overnight, Russian quality of life has completely changed, right? They're no longer going to have access to Netflix, nothing. Like their access to all of the Western products has just stopped overnight. Which is automatically going to send them closer to China, right? They're going to have to now get stuff from somewhere. So Russia and China are going to end up developing much, much, much stronger connections. So there's a massive financial crackdown happening now on Russia. The problem with that is that it has to be like all the countries doing it, or it doesn't help, right? Even if you have a couple of countries that are not doing it, even one country, so then it gives them a place to funnel all of their money and channel everything. And that's why even Switzerland, right? Switzerland, who took Nazi money, who took Nazi gold from Jewish teeth and made it into coins, and had no problem doing that for Hitler. But even Switzerland has joined the sanctions against Russia, which is like unprecedented. And that means that all of these Russians in the government and the Russian people in power can't access any of their money in their banks in Switzerland and in America and in France and all around the world. And that the hope is that that's going to pressure people, to pressure Putin to stop, right? In other words, if he's got his big businessmen who are the people who support him and people who keep him going, and they can't get to their yacht anymore, and they can't go to their house on the French Riviera, and they can't take out their money from the bank, they're going to say to Putin, stop this thing already, because I want to go out with my family on the yacht. So these economic sanctions are punishing Russians in general, which is not good. It's punishing the wealthy, powerful Russians, which they think is good, because that will help to pressure Putin. However, there's a problem with this, and that's Israel. And like I'm scared when this is going to start to become a more mainstream story, because it's not such a big story in the news yet. But Israel has not joined the sanctions, and not only that, but there's been like dozens of private jet flights logged from Moscow to Tel Aviv since the war began, which means that a lot of these Russian people are using Israel as a way to get their money out and to do things. And okay, now why would Israel do this? Well, there's two reasons. Number one, these people are called oligarchs, right? Oligarch. What's an oligarch? An oligarch is a businessman, a wealthy man, a wealthy person who is not elected to government. They don't have any official role in the government. However, they play a very powerful role because of their proximity to the government, right? So Mark Zuckerberg is like an oligarch, maybe, right, to some degree, right? He exerts control over the government because of his wealth and influence, right? So in Russia, it's very clear. There's like 7 of them. There was like, but there's a group of oligarchs who are clearly like Putin's crew. And when he came to power, he made deals with each of them in different industries, one like in the steel industry, one in the lumber industry, and basically said, like, you support me financially and I'll make sure that you're taken care of, and all the lumber and steel in Russia is going to go through you. So he has this group of 7 people, I think, the 7 oligarchs who are billionaires, and these are the people who are now. The problem is that not all of them are Jewish. Almost all of them are Jewish. Israelis, like Israeli, dual Russian Israeli citizens. and Israel is not going to be so quick to, to just like shut them out of Israel. And so that's number one. It's like a really sticky situation and really, not good, and something you really don't want the anti-Semites finding out about. But like most of these oligarchs, if you look, like their names are Jewish and you read their history, and they're Jews, they're Jewish people, and a lot of them have very, very strong ties to Israel, and have families here and stuff like that. So that's number one. It's like a really big complication that Israel has. That number two, which is more serious, is that Israel cannot risk upsetting Russia, because let's go back to our map. We have our own problem that we need Russia for. Here in Israel, we've been watching very carefully the civil war taking place in Syria. Okay, here's Israel, right? I'm coming to you right over here. So a little bit up north, right over here, Damascus, Aleppo, right? This is Syria, and there's been in Syria for years now has been a huge civil war going on, and a couple of years ago, Russia stepped in to help Assad, right? So Russia sent a huge amount of troops and armies and planes and tanks and all sorts of things to Syria in order to help Assad quell his civil war, right? He says it's against terrorists, of course. So Russia has a very large, right now, a very strong, large military presence in Syria. Okay, now that's very impactful for Israel, because throughout this civil war, the Israel has bombed Syria many times, right? And there's been times that Israel says that, Hezbollah, who is like the main terrorist organization in Syria, like they're getting a weapons shipment or something of missiles. So Israel has many times had airstrikes. You could just, do a Google search, airstrikes on Syria. In the past 2 years, you'll see there's been dozens of them. Every now and then, Israel just fly in, blow up a convoy or something, or a boat or something, and leave, because they claim that there are, weapons that are coming in. Now, anytime Israel does that, they do that in coordination with the Russians, because just like we were saying before, we don't want a war to start by accidentally a bomb, landing over the Polish border. If, God forbid, Israel was carrying out some sort of a raid on Syria and by accident took out a whole platoon of Russians, so that would be very bad, right? That would then require that the Russians respond to Israel in some way. So we don't want that to happen, and therefore Israel and Russia have very, very close security contact. And Israel is in touch with the Syrians in Russia, with the Russians in Syria, very closely, to make sure that we don't kill them while we're trying to protect ourselves. And the fear is that if Israel were to go all in on the sanctions, and Israel were to team up with the rest of the world and go up against Russia, then Russia would stop coordinating with Israel in Syria, and then we would be in really, really bad shape, because we would be, we would have less intelligence, and we'd be more, less, we would know less what was going on, and B, we would stand the risk then when carrying out some sort of an operation of, crossing paths with the Russians, and we don't want that to happen. So Israel is in a very sticky situation. I don't know exactly what they're going to do. At the very beginning, the first couple of days of the war, Naftali Bennett, who's the acting prime minister, he went to Russia, he met with Putin, then he spoke with Zelensky on the phone. Like Israel has a strong kesher with both countries. However, Israel is one of the few countries in the world that's not helping Ukraine. It's with weapons or anything. We're helping them with like first aid and medicine and stuff like that, but we're not sending any weapons to Ukraine, where the rest of the world is, because we're really nervous about not upsetting the Russians. So Israel's got like this double issue over here. On the one hand, the oligarchs are us, and on the other hand, right? I mean, somebody was just telling me, one of these big oligarchs, that there's like a huge kollel that this person supports. Like, he's not from, but like they give lots and lots of money to lots of Jewish organizations, and it's just, it's kind of strange. We'll have to see what happens. Okay, I just wanted to bring out one or two other quick points, just about. I just one other point, about this whole thing, and then if there's any questions. But I saw something that was crazy yesterday, and this has to do more with the last discussion that we had when we were speaking about Whoopi Goldberg and Neil Young and the censorship and all of that. So Justin Trudeau, who is the Prime Minister of Canada, who I hold as a very bad guy, mamish an evil man. So he was speaking about the war and what emboldened Putin to do this, right? Like why, how come for all the years until now he hasn't done it? And now all of a sudden, in 2022, all of a sudden Vladimir Putin feels, emboldened and chutzpahdik enough to go ahead and invade Ukraine. So why? So he actually said that, because we've seen over the past few years how misinformation and disinformation can proliferate online, and Putin saw how easy it is for narratives to be, crafted and changed. So that's why he was emboldened to go in, and therefore we need to double down on our fight against misinformation and disinformation. So I don't know if any of you realize what that is and what he's doing over there, but obviously that's absurd and there's nothing to do with this at all. And this is like the government of Canada's attempt to try to take something like this and use it to increase censorship, right? Like, oh, if Putin is only doing this because we're too lax on misinformation, well, then we better be censoring much more because we don't want to see another Ukrainian invasion. So it's like ridiculous. It's mamish like Justin Trudeau saying, like, Joe Rogan led to the Ukraine invasion. It's like, using this as a way to, enforce more censorship. And I think, it's such a blatant, ridiculous, it's so blatant and so, obvious how a government is trying to use a crisis just to further its own agenda. So I just wanted to point that out also, as just how people are going to use whatever they can use to further their points, but to try to say that the reason that Putin did this is because social media has allowed misinformation to proliferate is just something absurd. But it's scary absurd, because that means he's going to obviously try to use this as a way to enforce more censorship and such. So that's where we're holding. It's a very, very, again, as it's everything, very, very confusing time. It's like, we don't know who to believe and who to know. Like I said, America's moral standing and belief, like, their credibility is not where it should be or could be, and therefore it's very, very hard to know who to trust and what exactly is going on. What is for sure is that Ukrainian people are suffering, and that's not good. And Hashem, they should be safe. What's for sure is that we don't want to see this escalate in any which way. We don't want to see, and that's also like, right. I think you see that in the media a lot now in America. That, all these comparisons of Hitler to Putin, and all of these things, and they're like trying to get America riled up to want more action. But I think that that's a big mistake. I think we should be trying to, settle and calm things down, and chas v'shalom not be looking for things to escalate at all. Certainly daven today, Taanis Esther daven a lot today, tomorrow Purim, and Mirz Hashem, we should see peace in the world. Okay, let me see the chat. I'll see if there's any questions here on the chat to answer. I think with 19.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going back to the Congress hearing. Is it a bad thing that the truth was spoken? Like, what are the implications of the fact that Russia does have some legitimate claims against the West or against Ukraine having nuclear power that could be used against them?
Right, not nuclear, but biological. Well, I don't know. See, that's the problem, is that we can't know, because there's no honest broker anywhere. I'm saying that we don't know who's honest anymore about anything. So, I don't know what to say. But does that mean that it was legitimate what he's doing? I don't know that that makes it legitimate to invade a country just because they have a lab, you know. But the fact is that for weeks we were told that it's propaganda to say that there's a lab, and then Lamaisa there's a lab, you know. So it makes the who to believe much harder. But no, I'm not saying that therefore it justifies his going in, but the what am I trying to say? It's not, for sure it doesn't justify his going in, but the fact that they're so dishonest in the way that they try, I mean, if they would have just said up front, yeah, of course there are labs there, but that's not a reason to invade a country, that would have been very, very different than saying, of course there's no labs, and if you say there's labs, you're a Russian propagandist. Then whoops, don't look at that, but there's just one lab, or 25 labs, or so you hear what I'm saying. So I'm not saying it's a justification, but it certainly makes us look worse when we denied it as a factual thing and said to the world, he's just saying this in order to make propaganda, and then we're shown that we're wrong, right? That's no good, right? That makes us look stupid, and we are.
Can I ask a further question?
Yeah.
So, I'm just asking this because I signed up on the news a while ago and I stopped looking, but now things are I still don't want to look at the news. I still want to know what's going on a little bit. So what are the politically correct things that need to be that everybody needs to be saying, or the politically incorrect things that people are saying about Ukraine? Does that make sense, the question?
Yeah. So I'm saying this thing about the labs until 2 days ago was totally politically incorrect. That was if you until this hearing in Congress, if you would have said anything about the fact that that there are labs there and maybe it's dangerous and maybe we should hey, didn't COVID come from a lab that wasn't secured so well, maybe, and stuff like that. So you would have been called you're carrying water for Putin, you're a Putin propagandist, but now we know that's not true, right? So that the maybe their kavana in the beginning was they had a good kavana in trying to say that he's not justified in invading the country, but when you lie, so then it makes it hard to believe you later, even when you lied with the right kavana, and that's where we are, and they've done it a lot, and so it's we just don't know what the truth is or isn't. And in this one case, it happens to come out in a very embarrassing way. But that's, okay, let me see here. The driver runs record the class on COVID-19 agenda. Yeah, I'll post it again. Is it true that Russia is censored and that people don't know what's going on? Yes, that's definitely true. Russia is definitely what they're presenting to their people is totally different, and that they're presenting that the Ukrainians are doing this, and definitely the Russians don't necessarily know what's going on. They're regular Russian people. What I say, Putin is abusive. I mean, he's a pretty bad guy. He's definitely a bad guy. He's bombing, civilians. Is very bad. Yeah, Stephanie. I have to unmute yourself. Unmute. Sorry.
I'm not used to Zoom, thank God. Okay, also, so I saw headlines recently that the Russians are bombing Ukrainian hospitals and things like that.
Yes.
But there's no uproar in the world.
Well, no, there was. I mean, there was he bombed a maternity ward in Mariupol, and I don't know what level of uproar, but again, people will say a lot, but no one's going to do anything because no one's going to.
Oh, I feel I didn't even see big responses from
No, I mean, I saw that they wrote about it, but it's a war. There's a lot of civilians dying. It's never. I mean, it's a war. It's a real war with real bombs and. Terrible stuff. It's so I don't know.
He can't be brought to I don't even know what like the court for the countries.
I mean, he's committing war crimes. Any
Right,
yes,
he's committing war crimes. So like he's not going to get like punished for that because it's going to start World War III.
Well, I mean, there's no act. I mean, he is being punished. The sanctions and everything; those are the punishments. I mean, that's what we're doing. If he wasn't doing this, we wouldn't be putting those sanctions on him. Look, there is more that could be done. That they haven't done a naval blockade. In other words, like that I'll show you. Just like on the map, if they would, as of now, Russia is still able to ship and do get everything out through here. But if we would make a naval blockade over here, and that would make a big difference. So I don't there's still things that we could do that are not military. You know what I mean? There are still things, but we're almost maxed out. I mean, the sanctions and the financial punishment, so to speak, that we've been leveraging is almost as strong as it could be. Russia was kicked off of the SWIFT banking system. I don't know if you know what that means, but if any of you ever in life have to wire money, you ever deal that, like as a grown-up, you wire money from place to place, so when you wire money internationally, every bank has what's called a SWIFT code, SWIFT. It stands for something, and it's the way that banks trust each other to wire money internationally. In other words, if you wire money to America, so I need a SWIFT code. If you wire money to Israel, you need a SWIFT code. So Russian banks were removed from the SWIFT service, right? Which is crazy. I mean, that means that literally people in Russia can no longer wire money in or out. They just can't get money in or out. There are people who are Russian who were like away on vacation, and their credit cards just don't work anymore. Nothing works because their banks are sanctioned, right? So there's like, I saw a story in the news about some guy who's like, vacationing somewhere in Thailand, a Russian guy, and now he has nothing. He has no way to get home. He has no money. He has no, his bank is frozen, everything. Crypto is playing a very big role in this. Crypto, I mean, I'm a big believer in crypto. I think everybody should hold a little bit of Bitcoin. I think it's something, maybe we'll talk about it another time. But
you'll have to explain that in a different.
Maybe we'll do a Bitcoin. We'll do a Bitcoin cheer one time, maybe. But I am a very big believer in that, and it's already been a big help over here. It's been for even for the Jewish people. There was an article in Mishpacha about it. My wife told me that for the Jewish people, Chabad has been using crypto to help people in Ukraine in terms of getting money in and out, and it's also a way around the sanctions, right? That's a problem, but that's part of, in other words, you can't sanction Bitcoin. So any of those oligarchs who transfer their money to Bitcoin, they can't be sanctioned with it. But okay, anyway, I don't know. It's very confusing. There's a lot going on. It's like I didn't realize this Israel angle until a few days in, that Israel is like in a really precarious situation, and I'm really just like hoping the mainstream media doesn't pick up on it and it doesn't start becoming like big news stories like how come Israel is not but my Polish friends know my family and friend in Poland. I'm in touch with on WhatsApp a lot, and he's very upset about it. He's like very upset that Israel is not. That's a good question. I wonder what somebody's asking Avigago, like what do the Russian people think is going on about why all the American companies are leaving? It's a good question. That's a very good question. There was a story yesterday that there was somebody who went on to a news station with like a sign that said, war, no war, but it's Russia, you could go to jail for 15 years for protesting the war right now. Person who just like goes on the street with a sign that says, no war, they can go 15 years in jail. Okay, what are possible ways of ending this without World War III? Okay, that's a very good question. And that's actually like not at all weird or crazy. In other words, it could happen today, that there could be, let's go back to the map for a second. There's a certain area of Ukraine, which, okay, well, first of all, this whole area here, which is called Crimea, it used to be part of Ukraine, but Russia took it over a few years ago and annexed it. and Ukraine still fights with them about it. But so one thing that could happen is that Ukraine could agree that this area and this area also, the Donetsk region, like this area, that basically they would just give them up and let Russia take them, because that's like, there's like a dispute about whether those parts actually belong to Ukraine or Russia. So if Ukraine would say, you know what, you could take those places, and you know what, that's it, we're not going to join the EU, we're not going to join NATO, we give you a guarantee, something like that, it's possible that it could stop. In other words, there definitely does not have to end up in World War III. I don't think it's going to, Bezrat Hashem. I don't think it's going to. There definitely are ways in which that it could calm down and step back. At the same time, unfortunately, there's many other ways that it could trigger and get out of control. I hope it's not going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. It's very feasible that things can just calm down, and and it's feasible that it can remain not calm, but just remain in Ukraine. In other words, like Ukraine might be occupied now for years, and there might be some fighting here and there between Ukrainians and Russians, and it just doesn't spread into a bigger war. But nobody knows. And nobody knows, does Putin have bigger plans? Is this step one? And step two is, yes, going for somewhere else. And nobody knows. So we'll have to wait and see. And see what's this. Should all the Jews in Chutz La'aretz move to Israel now before it is too late? I hope not. I hope it's not almost too late. You know what I mean? I think there's still work to be done in Chutz La'aretz, spiritual work, and people need to be, wherever they're supposed to be. But I don't know. I was more thankful to be in Israel during COVID than like, I don't know, than now. I don't know if I feel like Israel is. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know. I hope nothing happens, but. I don't see why America would be affected by this in any way. You know what I mean? I don't see why. But you never know. I mean, look, no one ever knows anything. Anything could happen. Anything could happen. But daven. Don't forget today. Daven Natan. Taanis Esther. You got to daven Natan. Purim daven Natan. Right? Kol poshet yad no stimlo. Chazal say everybody who asks for tzedakah, you have to give them, and Hashem does that with us. Anything we ask Hashem and Purim, Kol poshet yad no stimlo. So Mitzvah Hashem, we should be zocheh. We should be zocheh to shalom in the world. All right, ladies.